For coming. Sorry, we're starting a bit late here, that was my fault. So today I'm excited to present Dr. Lepofsky. She's an archaeologist and an associate professor at the Department of Archaeology at the Simon Fraser University. And she is interested in social impact of past human interactions with their environment and has done lots of important work, especially with the herring fishery in the past, and an advocate of elevating the profile of those ancient fisheries like herring. And she is focusing on understanding the complexity of these fisheries, and her research focuses on working with First Nations here in BC and to gain more comprehensive understanding of their environmental issues involved. And she recognizes and appreciates the value of blending the knowledge from diverse communities, so like including First Nation knowledge into research perspectives. So please join me in welcoming Dana Lepofsky.
Before I say anything, I need to figure out how to do this. We good? Yeah. Great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you guys for coming. I'm glad Anna was running a little late too, because I had car trouble. Of course, it would have to happen that the day you need to drive across town from Deep Cove that your car would work. But I'm really glad to be here. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Musqueam Coast land, and you know, those of you who go to UBC probably hear that acknowledgement a lot, or I hope you do before you hear a public talk. But I think it's particularly important to do it in the context of the kind of research that I'm going to be sharing with you today, because if there's any punchline that I want you to take home today, it is that there is huge value in partnering with people that have different kinds of knowledge. So Western scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, people who just lived in a place for a long time. And I feel that the work that I'm sharing with you today is really kind of represents the blending of all that. And it's in part represented by why you see so many people on the list of people who are giving this talk today. I'm channeling all these people today. So imagine me and 12 other people standing up here. I particularly want to acknowledge Nicole Smith, my partner in crime. Nicole is an archaeologist, lives just not very far from here. Nicole and I and all these other people joined together in kind of recognizing the value of bringing these knowledges together, in this case for highlighting the importance of traditional management systems of the marine environments. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about ancient mariculture practices. I'm going to focus specifically on clams and bivalves, but as one aspect of the larger management system that indigenous peoples have here. So what's going to happen is I'm going to give you kind of an outline of the research and the kind of collective understanding of these ancient practices as reflected in all these people's knowledge and work. And then I'm going to turn it over at the end to Nicole to talk about how we're bringing this kind of research forward in the realm of public education, outreach, and kind of the cool kind of experiments we're doing with various communities. So I just want to add that you're really lucky to have Nicole here today. Nicole has an unbelievable amount of experience working on the British Columbia coast. She has worked, I figured this out when I was driving here and got lost on 16th, that you take the wrong turn on 16th, you end up in this kind of Shaughnessy vortex and you can never get out of there. It's really quite amazing. So, but Nicole has worked everywhere on the coast with probably every ethno-linguistic group on the coast, and I figured that she's worked on sites from like 13,000 years ago to 200 years ago. So isn't that cool? So she can tell you more about herself and her work in this, but I'm very lucky. Okay. In addition to the acknowledgements I already gave, there's some other people and I want to acknowledge, and I want to acknowledge up front in the spirit of this kind of collective work. There's a lot of mentors and collaborators and partners of communities and individuals in this represented in this talk. And really, as you'll see, I'm drawing in on a lot of different kinds of knowledges. I really, really appreciate that, as well as our funders, of which there are many. So I want to situate this talk today about traditional mariculture practices on the Northwest Coast in a larger discussion about how we view our landscapes and our seascapes, and that as many of you know, I think there is kind of a rethinking by ecologists. They're a little bit late in coming to this recognition, something that indigenous peoples and ethnobiologists have known for a long time, that much of the world has been altered by humans for millennia. And that applies not just to the land, but to the sea. And I would say that the sea has been relatively ignored in that discussion, in this kind of recent awakening. More so has been focused on the land. But I just want to kind of focus on these two pictures for a sec. This is a place that I'm privileged to work in the Central Coast. It's called Hoyet. And it's part of a project that we call From Mountaintop to Ocean Floor, because we think that everything in that watershed has been modified by people living there for millennia. What you're looking at here is a berry garden, cultivated berry garden. We're sure of it because there are some particular kinds of odd-looking plants that you just don't find anywhere else, and the density and diversity in this patch is unusual. Just beyond that, there are some fish traps, there are some clam gardens, which we'll be talking about more today, and there's some intertidal root gardens. And that's just what you can see from this photo, but it looks kind of natural. It's a highly managed, altered environment. This one's a little more obvious, I think, maybe to folks. You can see it's kind of a natural, kind of bedrocky area. It makes a really beautiful little arc there. And the First Nations here of the Gulf Islands region just took a little bit of rocks and piled them together and made a little fish trap here. This is the kind of thing that's very subtle, but is obviously would have been hugely effective and could easily be missed by archaeologists. Both of these things have been missed by archaeologists. So I think that we have this kind of, when we think about human interactions with the landscape, we tend to focus on the really dramatic stuff, the stuff that leaves really dramatic footprints. Certainly archaeologists do. And we tend to miss what my friend Felice calls these subtle ecologies, these more subtle modifications that were really important to people's lives over the millennia. And they've been missed by archaeologists, and we have kind of helped affirm this notion that a lot of this stuff is just wilderness. And now that we're opening our eyes and listening to people, listening to our teachers, we're seeing that in fact we're not looking at wilderness at all. So, as I mentioned, I think that in this kind of awakening around the importance of human impacts on wild places, human relationships with the marine environments have not been as well studied or as well understood. But in fact, if you look around the world, there's all kinds of very deep interactions with people with the marine environments that are embedded in larger management systems, which are in turn embedded in larger kind of worldviews. So one of my favorite examples is the Ama divers of Japan, reportedly a 2,000-plus-year-old tradition of women diving naked so that they can feel the water, that they can feel the waves of the person next to them and tell where the next person is, so they can actually space out the harvesting of abalone. So we're looking at a several thousand-year-old sustainable harvest of abalone that was really critical to the Ama people. It is still. But again, it's embedded in this kind of the way the Ama think about the ocean and think about kind of their interactions with the critters in the ocean. And so women talk about today that it just, like, to even put on a wetsuit feels it feels disrespectful to not go into the ocean kind of with nothing on, because they've lost that connection with the ocean. And I just love that. If any of you are divers, I think you'd appreciate that kind of imagery. But, you know, around the world, this is a picture of a Tongan woman collecting seaweed, limu. And we know, again, by talking to the women of Tonga, this is Melinda Orstop's work, that they actually had very carefully timed seasons of when they harvested the limu and how much they harvested. Again, all kinds of management practices that would be missed if you didn't pay attention and didn't ask. And then we see these archaeological sites, these very dramatic fish traps. This one happens to be in Chile. But again, we can imagine that there's a whole series of management decisions that go along with where this is placed, who gets to do it, when it happens, what size net went with it, whether you put the bones or not back in the water to acknowledge the fish ancestors so that something comes back next year. There's a whole series of practices which are largely invisible to us today that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about management. And so what about shellfish?
Well, around the world, one of the most prominent archaeological site type on the coast is shell middens. Big high piles of shell. Many of you paddled around the coast here, you know that the coast is full of these big, deep deposits of shell. This one happens to be in Patagonia. Pick place. These shell middens, if you can see, they've been used for making road fill and all kinds of great things like that. So we're losing the archaeological record of shell around the world very rapidly. But they're really interesting to me because they tell us about the importance of shell. Much of the archaeological record to date has been focused on trying to decipher when you look at shell at all, and mostly we don't. Mostly we get rid of the shell to look at the other goodies. When they look at shell, they're most interested in how have humans impacted shellfish. Like, is there a decline in size or number through time? You can see why the shell midden layers would be a really good record of looking at that. Very few people have looked at these shell records to look at, is there evidence of ancient management? So when they see the absence of small shells in the archaeological record, people assume optimal foraging. They're taking the biggest shells and bringing them home, and eventually they will impact that shell population. That's an assumption. When I see the absence of shells, listening to my teachers in my head, I think they're not seeing shells in the archaeological record because they're putting the small ones back, because they're cultivating that landscape. So it's a really different perspective, hey? One is about maximizing and taking the most. The other is about saying that we're going to actually save some for our kiddos for the future. So it's a really, what I'm arguing is that we can kind of turn our heads around and we'll start seeing evidence of this. All this has huge implications for the way we think about our landscapes and our seascapes today. People have assumed that Northwest Coast peoples focusing in here on the Northwest Coast are passive hunters and gatherers and fisher folk, that they haven't really modified their landscape. And it's meant that there's all kinds of policies that have allowed those ecosystems to be taken away from indigenous peoples. So BFO, for instance, has their definition of a wild beach is a beach that has no modern aquaculture on it today. And I have to say that I think it's kind of odd when I see those wild beaches and a 4-meter midden, 4 meters of shell right behind the beach. I find it odd that would be a wild beach. That's a beach that's been tended, that's been tilled, that's been used for thousands of years. Not so wild. I think that we need to learn that, you know, science is great, but that's only going to be one avenue for understanding these traditional aspects of interacting with your environment. And there's lots of other ways to learn about the past. And as I said, one of the punchlines is that I think we have a lot to learn from traditional ecological knowledge about the past and how we can implement that in our understanding of ecosystems today and into the future. So here on the Northwest Coast, as I mentioned, we have a kind of this continuum of management we now know from land to sea, from mountaintop to ocean floor. And what I've done here is just listed a bunch of the practices that we know from First Nations. This is largely through the fantastic work of Nancy Turner, my good friend and mentor. And really, if you look, all these smaller dots, the crosses, are the work that kind of Nancy, through all her First Nations friends, have helped document. So we know, for instance, that ownership in all the different ecosystems was a major part of the traditional management systems. What I've done is bolded with these crosses the places where we have archaeological evidence, where we actually can see those indicators in the archaeological past. And you can see, hey, that there's actually very few bolded crosses. So it means that if we just rely on the archaeological record without talking to traditional knowledge holders, we miss a huge part of what was made up the traditional management systems. So here on the coast, we're hugely lucky that we can collaborate, partner with indigenous knowledge holders. I just want to say that in many parts of the coast of the world, we don't have that option. Indigenous peoples are too separated from their land, they've been exterminated. We just don't have this they don't have the options for the same kinds of collaborations. So if you imagine if you took away those light-colored crosses, it would look pretty blank. And people would think, traditional management of ecosystems wasn't that important, and especially not in the intertidal area, which is what I want to talk about today. So here, as I mentioned, we're very blessed to be working with lots of different people, lots of knowledge holders that have informed what we know about marine resource management, and particularly clam management and clam gardens, which we'll talk about in a sec. My mentor and very dear friend, Quaxistala, Clam Chief Adam Dick, talking to Nancy Turner. This is kind of like a caption of my favorite people in my life. Dr. Daisy C. Ruth Smith, John Harper, Les Adams, Kirsten Roll, Ann Solomon, and then you know Ann from the Fisheries work, yeah. A collaborator of mine, and Judith Williams, who kind of, among the people that first kind of brought clam gardens into the thinking of Western scientists. It's a really lovely story that Adam tells when John Harper, through Nancy, first called Adam to talk about these clam gardens, these mariculture features that I'm going to talk about in a sec. So these are management features for managing clams. So John, who'd been trying to get archaeologists to pay attention to these for like a decade, calling around, no one's saying, you know, it's no, they're fish traps, people didn't manage clams, clams weren't important. Kind of funny, never given those shell middens. John calls Nancy, Nancy says, you should call Adam, Adam calls. Adam gets a call from John, and John said, have you ever heard about these rock walls that people used to use for managing clams? Is that possible, Adam? And Adam said, well, yeah, those are lochiwe. So what? And he told me it was like someone called him and asked him what a fork was. He thought it was the oddest question coming out of the blue that someone would say, do you know about these features? Because they were so much part of his life, but no one had asked him. Here on the Northwest Coast, we know that clams are hugely important. We know they're important in not just into the middens, but into the worldview that we see kind of course, the very famous Bill Reed's carving here at the museum. We see it in masks, this is a Helsick mask. Clams are fundamental to how people related to the spiritual world and the physical world. It's embedded in how people lived here. So we think, us folks who are being channeled through me today, think that there's lots of reasons to study ancient mariculture, and in this case, again, specifically focusing on bivalves. I could spend a whole lecture talking about any of these things, but we realize that this is kind of just one cool thing, one way to get into studying ancient management on the coast. Lots of different avenues of study. And in recognizing that, we have come together in something called the Clam Garden Network. People representing a whole range of different kinds of knowledges up and down the coast to study traditional mariculture practices. So we called ourselves the Clam Garden Network because calling us the Clam Network just didn't sound as good. You know what I mean? Just like, and we go CGN in our emails now, we feel really like big people. So, what is a clam garden? What is this thing? What is this feature, this physical evidence of ancient clam management? So for those of you who don't know, and I think a lot of people do nowadays know what these are features that have been altered again to increase the productivity of clams. They're extraordinary because unlike a lot of those other management techniques we talked about, you can see this one when you start looking. If you happen to be at the zero tides for the 78 daylight hours of the summer where you can do field work. Other than that, you miss them. But if you look at those times, they're obvious and they're everywhere. Imagine a natural beach. Natural beach slope. This is an idealized zone of where clams do really well. Low tide and high tide represented by the blue. Take a natural beach, you put a terrace wall in front, you let some sediment accumulate behind with the tides. It probably happens very quickly with some of our winter storms. Your terrace wall is just built at a certain tidal height so that that zone of ideal clam growth all of a sudden gets maximized. Can you all see that? So it's basically just by changing the slope, we've just taken a wedge of idealized habitat and increased it. So, how do we find out about clams and clam gardens and clam management in the Clam Garden Network? Well, one thing we're doing, as I said, is we're talking to people. We have a lot of collaborators among the Helsick, the Wasanich, the Hunkaminam, and we've done a lot of interviews. And this is Nicole up there with Elroy, who's taking Elroy White from Helsick First Nation, talking to the Reeds, Nathan Cardinal in Gulf Islands National Park, talking to people in Gulf Islands about a whole range of things having to do with clam management. And we're finding out a lot. So it's pretty funny that all this time, there was just people just kind of next door to us who knew this, but we never asked. I never asked. So we find that there's a lot of different management practices, that tilling and adding of sediment, the side selection we talked about, when you harvest, when don't you harvest. All those things were known to people, that if you want to make those huge shellmans, if you want to have a high population density and survive on the coast, you got to be tending the clams over the millennia. We found out that there's special places to harvest clams, that clam gardens are abundant on the landscape. We found out how to harvest and process clams. We found out a lot about the changes in practices and the changes in ecology today. What happens when you stop tilling? What happens to those beaches when you stop harvesting and tending them? And we found out that clams and clam digging are hugely important to kin relations. And when people are restricted from getting access to clam harvesting beaches, it has huge impacts. It's not just not getting food, it's about not getting that connection to your grandkids, your grandma, to place, to who you are. Just one of the quotes I want to share with you to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we're learning. This has a lot in this quote. It says, you put your small clams back in the ground and either step on it or bury it again. So we always have clams. Don't let the seagulls get them. If you look after it, it'll come back. So cultivate our beaches. Take out the dead ones, and you can't just throw the dead ones away because they might still have seed shell in them, seedlings. They breathe too, as well. When you're cultivating the soil and the ground gets too packed, they'll suffocate. Sounds like management to me. So in addition to the interviews, we're working with people who are interested in green governance, and working here in Helsick First Nation just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're doing. Paul Stephanie from University of Guelph is working with Helsick First Nation to, first of all, map all these clam gardens, map all the traditional clam harvesting places, map all the oral traditions that talk about clams, and then map that onto current clam tenures. And it's going to have huge implications for rights and title for the Helsick, as you can imagine. These dots have been generalized so that, yeah. You can see that people want to know. Like, nations are calling us all the time saying, we think we have clam gardens in our territory. What does this mean for rights and title and ownership and access to the foreshore? Can you help us here? We're doing a lot of experiments. We're interested in kind of the effects of water and flow and temperature on the recruitment of baby clams, the growth of clams, the survivorship. And we've done 3 different sets of experiments now, which I'll show you a video on in a sec. This is Anne Solomon of Know and Julia Jackley have a paper coming out on this in Ecology and Society soon, basically showing that when you compare clam gardens, these terraced beaches, to beaches without, and I have to tell you, it's hard for us to find beaches without, now that we're looking. It's super interesting in of itself. But when you can find them, that the clam gardens are many, many, many times more productive, that the baby clams do better, they grow faster than in the beaches without. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. Marco's still analyzing his data, but it looks like from the clams that I helped him tag in the lab, he's going to be finding the same thing. So hugely more productive than an unmodified beach. We're also interested in kind of looking at the shell hash, this broken shell that fills in behind that terraced wall that I showed you. The sediment's quite a bit lighter, it's quite a bit different in a clam garden beach than non. And we're interested is, does that shell hash actually help larval clam survival? And we're doing some experiments. This is Kirsten Roll and Daphne Monroe from Rutgers with their student Laura. They're comparing just basically inorganic carbon in the control versus the clam garden, and finding obviously there's a lot more carbon, a lot more shell in the clam gardens, and that little recruits are doing better. This is particularly important to us today as our oceans are getting more and more acid. So this is actually set in the context of ocean acidification. Are clam gardens a better place to grow clams than non-clam beaches because of just the shell hash, because there's more carbon in them? And it seems like, you know, based on a small sample, that that's what it's looking at. Very quickly, because, how are we doing for time? You want to?
Yeah, I've got 10, 12 minutes.
Left. Okay, so I'm going to breeze through this because I want to turn it over to Nicole. Just to show you some of the archaeology that we're doing on Quadra Island. Quadra has, in northern Quadra, has some of the highest densities of, if not the highest densities of clam gardens anywhere on the coast so far. Basically, these yellow dots are clam gardens, and the triangles are middens. Lots. Very hard to find controls here in Quadra. This just shows you what it looks like from Google Earth. So if you guys pick a place on the coast and you want to see a clam garden, I don't have a clicker that works, but can you see that dark line in that bay there? That's a clam garden wall. There's another clam garden there. And what you think is just looking like natural shelf, if you see the shelf turn at a funny angle, that's a clam garden. Can you guys see it? See that kind of, that's not natural shelf. And see how it goes like that and then turns back that way? That's all clam garden. So take out Google Earth, it's really fun to do. This did, sure. This is just to give you an idea of some of the ecology experiments that we're doing. This is my friend Anne.
We are here on Quadra Island in White Bay. In this bay alone, right here, there are 49 clam gardens. Clam gardens are prehistoric rock walls that people made in ancient times to, we think, increase the productivity of clams. And what you can see right here is one of the rock walls. So if you look at the dark strip in the water,
Made it worse, right?
Yeah.
Right.
people rolled,
Can you hear it?
as we hear from elders, rolled rocks down to the edge of the water at low tide to make these walls. And here we are at high water, or high tide, so you can see the clam gardens flooded. So the clams right now have their siphons out, they're filtering phytoplankton from the water, but it's this clam garden structure that actually creates like a terrace. And what we're doing here today is we're looking at an experiment where we're actually measuring the growth rates of the clams to ask, do you get faster growing clams and more clams in clam gardens than non-clam gardens? And so really, how did people actually perform these ancient forms of mariculture?
So just to give you an idea, get back to it. This is just some of the data from that one place, that clam gardens, basically the bottom line is that clam gardens are more productive than non-walled beaches, and a lot more productive if you look at number 4. We're also pairing this kind of, these experimental data with archaeological data, of course, and I have to show you this video, equal time, the archaeology. Okay. This is us excavating in those 3 hours of daylight that we can see the clam garden in a 5-day window per month for 4 months of the summer. And then it's gone. So you can imagine that research is kind of slow. So we're learning a lot, though, about when we excavate these clam gardens. And besides that, we know we can have to move fast. We're digging trenches in the clam gardens, and we're doing that for 2 reasons. One is to see how they're built, and we're finding that they're built deliberately and quickly in many cases. So if you see here, you can see all these rocks are lying horizontal. They're actually bringing those rocks from the upper intertidal and laying them down here. So you can imagine then, if you're trying to maximize productivity, it's going to matter actually where you're placing it in the intertidal, right? You want it in a particular zone to maximize clam growth. So you can imagine how I imagine in my mind's eye is that there is an engineer, there's someone coordinating this thing. Take those rocks from there, put them down here and to this height. And we're actually measuring the height, so that the tidal heights, and we see they're very, very carefully regulated. We're also interested in excavating them because we can date them. And we're interested in finding shells that have been trapped. If you can imagine, when they're building the wall, there are shells that are living on the beach. They're building the wall, they put a rock on top of the shell, they kill the shell, and that's waiting for us to do radiocarbon dating on it. Perfect. Okay? We're also working on some fancy dating with optical simulated luminescence, which I won't go through here. But just to give you some idea of the kind of dates we're getting back on these things. So what a cross-section looks like. This is Nicole standing at a beach where there's actually 2 clam gardens, one high and dry and one lower. And you can see them relative to tidal height, which is what those numbers are there. And by looking at the shells, just like I showed you, we get a date of around 1800 and around 1,000 years ago for the building of these 2 rock walls. We're really excited about that. It's a big deal in archaeology to be able to date rock. I mean, we're not really, right? But you see rock features and think, oh, you can't ever date them. So actually to be able to date these and put them so far back into prehistory just puts a nail in the coffin of saying that people weren't doing this stuff in pre-contact times. What's also really interesting about this is you see there's an older one higher up. In some cases, they're so high up that they're outside of kind of productive beach today. And we think that this reflects dropping sea level in this case, where you're getting these older ones stranded high on the beach, yeah? And as the sea level drops, remember you need to have them at a perfect tidal height. They're moving the rock wall down to follow the sea level change. Does that make sense? Yeah. Just another one to show you, because I'm showing off a bit here because we're so excited. This triple wall beach, you know, this stuff is great. And then we got some more dates on them as well. We see weird things like this one underwater. This is in the lowest low tide of the year. This one's still 40 centimeters below water level. And we think there's a local subsidence event that makes this one underwater. It's weird, and we need divers to actually excavate it. I don't know what we're going to do with something like this. Like, I don't know how we can ever date it. But it's going to maybe just remain a mystery, but that's okay. We're also interested in digging in the middens and in the beaches themselves to figure out just kind of how productive they were in the past. Remember, we did these experiments comparing modern ones? What were they like when they were active? So we're doing a couple things. We're looking at the sediments in the beach before the clam garden filled in, yeah? And then after. And we're looking at the growth rates and the relative abundance of the shell in the 2 different environments. So we're treating it like an archaeological site, which they are. We're also looking at just that at the gardens themselves, so we're seeing the majority of them in Quadra, like 90% of them in one bay, are built on bedrock. So it's not like they're taking an okay beach and making it better. They're taking bedrock and making it a fabulously productive beach. So think about then our coast and how shell is so abundant here. A lot of that is totally the result of manufacturing by people. We're doing the same thing by digging in middens, where we're looking at middens and saying, what is the relative, like the change in clam growth and abundance through time? That's what Misha and Louis are doing here. Are they more abundant, less abundant, pre and post clam gardens? Are they growing faster? Does the species relative abundance change? We're doing a whole lot of things about trying to figure out kind of where do these things sit in terms of food security, productivity, identity, and then bringing this forward into modern management discussions. One of the things that we're really excited about doing is reconstructing a clam garden. We're hoping to do this both in, we will be doing this in Parks Canada and also maybe up north as well. So you can imagine that we're learning all this about kind of traditional management practices, but now we can actually apply them experimentally. So you can imagine reconstructing a clam garden, taking half of it, doing tilling on one and not in the other, size selection on one and not in the other, and actually say, actually empirically, based on traditional ecological knowledge, how productive can these things be today? Can we use these techniques in modern management? I will turn it over to Nicole to talk about our outreach event. Sorry, you hold it. Yeah, that's a really quick one.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Okay, well thanks. Thanks so much, Dana, for the invite to speak today. Like Dana, I'm a clam garden fanatic and just can't get enough of them. So it's always a treat to come to talks like this and actually talk a little too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the education and outreach programs that we've been trying to build around clam gardens. And one of them is the Learning by the Sea program that's happening down in the Southern Gulf Islands. As Dana mentioned, Parks Canada just recently got significant funding to do an experiment to rebuild 2 clam gardens, one within Gulf Islands National Park Reserve on Russell Island, and another just outside of the park in Fulford Harbor on Salt Spring Island. And so they're working really closely with the Wasanich and Hulkaminam nations to figure out the most appropriate ways to rebuild and reactivate these features. They're in discussions about how to do that and hoping to actually start tilling the ground, rebuilding some walls this summer. So the Learning by the Sea program is, So the Learning by the Sea program is a project that's working closely with the Restoration Project, and it's embracing the traditional teachings that elders and knowledge holders have been sharing with us about these clam gardens as places of learning. So they're not just places where people are going out and harvesting clams. One thing elders and knowledge holders are sharing is that there's so much more going on than just clams. There are all sorts of other species that are being potentially enhanced by these features. Lots of other activities that are happening here. And just as importantly, these are places where traditionally elders and youth would come together to learn about ecology, but also about worldview, about economics, and about how to be a part of a family and a community. So we're really trying to embrace that idea with the Learning by the Sea program. And this is a project that is being run through Parks Canada, Royal Roads, in partnership with the Wasanich and Hulkaminam nations, members at School District 79, Northwest Indian College. And this was our first year, and we essentially had 3 activities that we were hoping to achieve, which we did. One was to have science and culture camps for First Nations youth. So these were opportunities to bring Hulkaminam and Wasanich youth to clam gardens to learn about traditional teachings around clam gardens, but also about the science on clam garden features. So they were helping to do some of those baseline shellfish data collection that's going to really inform the data collection once the restoration project actually starts happening. And they were learning about this in a culturally relevant way. So it was a very, very fun summer. We had the Wasanich group come out in June and the Hulkaminam group come out in July. And then we've also been, in addition to the summer camps, we've been working with educators to brainstorm around lesson plans about clam gardens that we can incorporate into different grades within the provincial curriculums. So this is a really exciting time right now because the learning standards and curriculum are changing within BC, and they're changing in some interesting ways that are really excited to have programs like this that are holistic and not just looking at sort of siloed scientific studies, but are combining some of this science and culture together. The other thing that we've done is with the Learning by the Sea program is we had a community outreach event on November 3rd at the Shaw Ocean Discovery Center. And here it was a real celebration of clam gardens. It was an information night, and we had probably about 40% of the audience from the local nations and the other 60% just interested general public. And it was a really wonderful event to bring communities and cultures together. And one thing that's really standing out with clam gardens is that people love these features and they want to learn more, and they're just so good at bringing people together. And in an environment like this, it was wonderful to have sort of that cross-cultural communication, because we just don't have enough of those events where people can come together and share. So the Learning by the Sea was a pilot project and a very successful first year. We're hoping to have funding to be able to continue this for the next 3 years. And then, sorry Dana, how did you advance? Great, thanks. So, we've been talking about ways to really embrace this enthusiasm that the public has been showing towards clam gardens. And so some of us in the network have been brainstorming about ways that people could be involved in the stewardship of these places. And one idea that has emerged is to have a citizen science website and phone app where people can actually help us to map clam garden locations on the coast. So people can go to their local beach at low tide, see if they can find any of these structures, and then upload that information to a database and map, and people can help populate the coast with clam garden locations. Because we can't see clam gardens, well, because we can only see them at so few hours a year, we really need help to map the locations of these places. So we're excited about possibilities like this. And in the meantime, if anyone's interested in clam garden research or joining the Clam Garden Network, we're really an inclusive group. So email us or contact us. We'd be happy to add you to our distribution list. And we also have a Twitter account, which is @ClamGardeners. So please feel free to follow us. We're going to have a website that we're going to be launching in a few weeks too, fingers crossed. So we'll be able to post on there emerging clam garden research and try to create a community online as well. So thanks for the chance to speak to you.
Thank you.
We're a bit short in time. We have time for one question, but I think Dana and Nicole are going to hang out after for a little bit so we can have some follow-up discussions with them. So the students first, one question. Ready? Yes, Ken?
Yeah, how far north and south did this clam garden technology run?
Yeah, such a great question, and I should have said, so thank you. How far north and south do these go? Thanks to the flyovers of geomorphologist John Harper, we know that they're Alaska all the way down to Washington. And we only know Washington from some early ethnographic records. No one's found them, but if you think about kind of if you go north to south in terms of how impacted the foreshore is, we're going to start losing them. So we know they were in Washington. We have yet to find them. They're obviously throughout BC and into Alaska. Whether they're anywhere else in the world, we have a paper in press now, and I'm actually putting a call out to archaeologists saying, pay attention. Because I suspect that similar kinds of features are elsewhere in the world as well, and again, we just haven't looked. My guess.
So right now we have them, as Dana said, Southeast Alaska, and we've also found them Hawaii, Central Coast, Breton Archipelago, the Discovery Islands area, west coast of Vancouver Island, Southern Gulf Islands. So they're appearing right up and down the northeast coast.
They're probably places you guys walk everywhere, so they're not going to be on the kind of sandy UBC kind of beach, but if you're on any rocky intertidal, make a point to go in the low tide. I bet you'll find them. It's very cool, and they've been hidden from our eyes for a long time. Thank you.